I'm a slashaholic, addicted to the fight. Narration so igniting, Josh keeps me up all night. Lies and masks and pain, blood runs like the rain. Evil finds its way in spine-chilling fray. Out of brick but not out of light. Horror digs, don't look behind. Feel the terror crave. Will you dare to slave? I'm a slashaholic, addicted to the fight. Narration so hypnotic, Josh keeps me up all night.
Murder Report, an original novel by James Acosta. Chapter 4. Well, get ready to buckle up for this. As I said before, I hadn't murdered anyone else for at least 2 whole years. After all that time had passed, the urge to murder was gnawing at me no matter what. No matter how hard I tried to push the urge away, it just kept coming back to me, like a tidal wave. Not to mention I was very disappointed on my last murder and how it played out. I really wanted to go over the top with the next one. It ended up taking a while. But I did finally figure out how I would go about it. Just like how an author will overcome writer's block from time to time. Oh yes, I forgot to mention something very important. My island was just some offshoot island, but it still remained in America. It was just about 100 miles away from the LA shores, if that makes any sense. I suppose I dropped that tidbit because it becomes integral to my story for later on. One thing to mention about my island is that I have never had any issues with the Coast Guard, pirates, tourists, and on and on. The surrounding of my island had several jagged rocks and other objects, so it was perfect for keeping bigger boats from getting too close to it as well. Well, enough with that nonsense. Get that out of the way. I just felt it was necessary to give you guys an idea of how far I would have to travel to meet my next victim. You see, I needed something that no normal person would collect. Maybe, except doctors or scientists. I needed leeches, and a shit ton of them too. At the very mention of the leeches, Carol once again felt queasy. The idea of squirmy, creepy-crawly things like centipedes, worms, and even leeches was all it took to make her skin crawl. She wasn't looking forward to finding out why Joe needed them. Carol couldn't help but feel like she had a small idea. Max didn't handle hearing it well at all, as he ended up needing to rush off to the bathroom. Joe laughed his ass off. He piped in for a second and said, "You seem to have a stronger stomach than he does." The one thing that did stand out to Carol's attention was that it seemed Joe couldn't help but enjoy himself in seeing others' misfortunes. This annoyed her very much. She decided to just push her frustration to the side and refocus on what she was here for. About 3 minutes had passed until Max returned. He seemed to be calmer and more focused as well. He leaned into Carol's ear and whispered, "Please forgive me about that. I'm going to try and keep my cool a little better than I have been." Carol simply nodded. With that, Max again went back to the camera and hit the record button. Carol turned her head back to Joe. "Well, Joe, it's time that we continue where you left off. You have our attention and the camera is rolling." Joe nodded. "Very well. Now you see, I needed the leeches for my next murder project. I thought very hard about how and where I was going to obtain them. I figured I could find some of the west side of the United States. However, it was harder for me to find any. I figured one day that I would happen to have better luck in the southern part of the country. So shortly after deciding where to go, and due to a severe boredom spell, I decided the trip would do me some good. A way to get away from my home and travel, and live my life and all that. Carol was offended at the mere mention of that. Here this psychopath is enjoying his own life, and in the meantime he is snuffing other people's lives out. The audacity of this asshole. She just quelled her anger deep inside. There was a moment of an awkward pause. Then Joe continued on. "Well, any guesses where?" No response. "You guys are no fun. Anyways, it was Mississippi. It was just the state that I had in mind for me to look for leeches, and it was, indeed, successful, as far as me finding them. When I was ready for the trip, I packed up all the things that I knew I would need, my laptop, clothes, and other items. Once I had all that I needed, I headed out to the mainland using my private jet. I headed off to the LA International Airport. When I finally landed the plane, I boarded another actual flight. I paid for the first-class ticket, of course. It was for Chattanooga, Mississippi. I slept just about the entire flight. When I did finally land, I hailed a taxi to one of the most lavish hotels around. Once there, I checked in at the front counter with the clerk. Once I made it to my room, I hooked up my laptop and got to work on my plan. It first involved doing some research. I searched online for local ads. While I was doing that in my hotel, I was also doing some sightseeing on the side as well. I mean, to be honest, I had never been to this side of the country before, so it was all very new to me. I most definitely tried and enjoyed many of the local meals in the area. As Joe was droning on, he realized that Carol and Max were both drifting off to sleep. He decided to skip the boring part. "Okay, I get it. I went on a trip, yada yada yada." Joe's booming voice alerted both Carol and Max. "Now that I have both of your attentions, I will continue. I was searching online for what you would say, more like searching for things on the dark web. If you don't know what it is, it can be used as a black market in a sense. I ended up finding a merchant that happened to sell only leeches, and ended up spending about a couple grand on them as well. I made sure to have the leeches directly shipped to a specific address that I had already set up in LA. You see, at one point in time, I made sure to have a plain and simple house somewhere in LA. It was just a one-bedroom. Its sole purpose was just for me to have a place to stay, other than my island. So that was this location that I had the leeches sent. I was promised that the leeches wouldn't be harmed during the transport. Come to find out, when they finally arrived, they were placed into some pretty sturdy fish tanks. They were shipped inside some wooden crates as well. This was to hide what was contained inside. Once I knew my shipment arrived safe and sound, I smuggled them back to my island, which was a piece of cake for me. I loaded all 3 of the wooden crates onto my yacht. Once all 3 were safely secured, I was ready to head back to my home on the island. When I finally made it back home, I had my servants help me load all 3 of the crates back to one of the rooms to make a fish aquatic type of a room. Once all 3 crates had made it, I instructed my servants along, and wearing pairs of rubber gloves, they all helped me to lower the leeches into their respective fish aquarium. This tank was massive, enough for quite a few fish. I might say I also considered this the first item to be a part of my exotic animal collection. I got to see them squirm around in the water. It was such a wonderful sight for me. Then it occurred to me, what if I got a huge aquarium for piranha fish as well? Carol instantly shuddered at piranhas. She tried to keep her mind from jumping to the possibility of... Joe continued onward. Having all the key items finally together, I could set out the next part of my plan for the murder. The only problem was I wasn't exactly sure how I wanted to go about it just yet. One day it hit me like a ton of bricks. I would try to find a marine biologist if I obtained other exotic fish like sharks, octopus, and so on. They would be even more possibly interested in me and what I was all about, even if it was all just a ruse to draw them into my trap. So with a little bit more research online, I soon found my perfect candidate. It just so happened that she was about to start a Protect the Aquatic Life campaign. She was looking to earn a lot of cash through a fundraiser event. The money would go directly to protecting the ocean and its wonderful critters. Carol rolled her eyes at this point. Luckily, Joe didn't notice this, as he closed his eyes while he was letting the yawn out. After Joe finished, he continued. I soon found out that her name was Melanie Parks. I did a background check on her. Turns out she was in her 30s and she had been a marine biologist for 10 years or so. She also had a lot of experience in handling wild fish around the world. Fish like piranhas, stingrays, and more. Just so happened that I was one lucky man that week. The fundraiser campaign was to start Saturday, and it was only Monday at the time I was looking into her. Not before long, I plotted out my next trip to where she was. This time, I ended up flying to Orlando, Florida, where I landed the following Tuesday morning. I hooked myself up with another hotel and settled myself till that Saturday. I just lounged around in my PJs, ordered some food room service, watched TV, and smoked lavish cigars as well. Pretty much just killing time until her fundraiser started. When the time came, I got all cleaned up, and I dressed as sharp as a tack. I was wearing the common black suit and tie. I looked like one of the... Nah, never mind. When I finally approached her, I walked up and I dropped literally a couple bundles of cash into Melanie's donation box, worth $40,000. She was very impressed and gracious indeed. This most definitely got her attention, and with a little wordplay, the next thing we knew, we were boozing it up at one of the nearby bars. I, of course, bought out the entire bar. In doing so, we took our time in getting to know each other, just like I had done before with the previous victims. I, too, had to gain her trust. Melanie soon learned all about me, my wealth, my island, and so on and so forth. I soon brought up how I just couldn't resist exotic fish and other creatures. I even told her about my piggy farm. Joe gave a quick smile, as if he just told a funny joke. Carol and Max, however, were both not amused, of course. Joe shook his head in a playful manner and continued on. Melanie didn't know about these creatures that I had purchased, and I was telling her all about me and my fake interest in these creatures. It only took the rest of that weekend to finally convince her to come back to my island and check out my collection. I even managed to gain enough of her trust to let me blindfold her. I explained to her that I was, well, a very high-profile individual. I didn't want the press to ever discover where I really lived. This was all a bullshit lie, of course, but Melanie bought it hook, line, and sinker. No pun intended. The other thing that I couldn't believe was she had a distaste for tech. She absolutely refused to own a cell phone and claimed that the only phone she ever had was a landline. This meant that it would be even easier for me, as I wouldn't have to worry about being tracked. Yes, I know I happened to draw this story out for too long as well. I promise I'm getting to what I'll at least consider the best part. Carol thought, oh God, please do. Joe carried on. If anybody guessed it, we hung out for a while. At least 2 months' worth, anyway. Unfortunately for me, I hadn't intended for this to happen. Melanie ultimately developed feelings towards me. After she confided to me about it, I knew that I couldn't waste any more time. The last thing I wanted for myself, as well, was to start feeling the same way towards her. That would only just make things weird and complicated. There was only one time that something like that sorta happened, but we will get to that part of the story later. So with this recent news, I enacted my plan. I couldn't afford to let her stay another night. The only real problem was that my servants were still home. I didn't pay them to leave me this time, but I wasn't going to let that stop me. I invited Melanie to hang out with me in my fish room. It was also in this room that I had a very expensive and elaborate stereo. If it was turned on loud enough, it could just about drown out any sound that could be made in that room. She was indeed impressed with what I had done with that room. I managed to acquire a few other fish like the octopus and a few clownfish in a separate tank as well. The wall was decked out with wonderful paintings that included dolphins, coral reefs, and stuff like that. The room seemed to her to be perfectly breathtaking. I had a theme for her murder room, and she was a marine biologist. Ironic, isn't it? The one thing to mention, though, is that she was unaware of the leeches. That could have possibly caught her off guard, and I didn't want to take a chance. She would soon learn about them. Oh, yes. Oh, my, it seems that I forgot to mention the description of this woman. Melanie was black-haired and wore the geekiest glasses you've ever seen. She had the bluest of eyes and was indeed a very attractive young woman. She didn't weigh very much, which was fine with me. It only made it easier for what I was about to do next. I instructed her to sit down on the only chair in the room. Once she did, I slowly made my way over to the stereo and turned it on. It played classical music that I personally picked out. It was so loud that it was almost difficult to hear the both of us talk, which is exactly what I wanted. With the music now blaring out loud, I then slowly made my way back to Melanie. I produced a blindfold and I offered up some kinky fun time. I knew just exactly how she felt about me. I knew that Melanie would say yes. She did agree and told me that she trusted me. I handed the blindfold over and asked her to place it directly and gently around her eyes. Melanie did so willingly. I did reassure her that this was all in good fun and that I had a special surprise for her. Carol couldn't help but wonder where this story was going to go next. She refocused back on Joe as he yammered on. You see, she seemed to be enjoying all of this. Once I knew that she was completely blindfolded, I made my way over to a cupboard where I stashed a rope. I made my way directly right behind her and tied her wrists together. Melanie laughed and made a comment about me really being into the kinky shit. Like I've mentioned before, none of this stuff ever did anything for me. I simply ignored her remark and moved forward with my plan. Knowing that she was strapped, I went to another drawer of the same cupboard and pulled out a thick pair of rubber gloves. With the gloves on, I made my way over to where I was hiding the leeches. I grabbed a nearby bucket with one free hand, and I scooped a bunch of leeches into the bucket with a scooper with my other hand. I made sure to grab about a handful or so of the leeches and made my way back to Melanie. I positioned myself directly behind her chair and placed my 2 lips directly behind her neck. I wanted to give her the impression that I was giving her a gentle hickey. This was simply to mislead her. After a few moments of me doing this, I stopped for a few seconds. Melanie let out a gentle laugh, indicating that she was still enjoying herself. Right after that, I placed a single leech on the spot where I was giving the hickey. She cried out loud that I was sucking a little too hard. I told Melanie that it wasn't me that was sucking anymore. Her confusion soon turned to panic. I walked directly right in front of her and raised the bucket with my right hand. Melanie screamed out loud in pain at this point. I kicked right in her stomach, just enough to knock her over, while she was still sitting in the chair. When this happened, the back of her head hit the floor first. She was still conscious. Here, she screamed even louder at the moment. She just kept asking me, why? I ignored her pleas or cries. It had no impact on me at all. The next thing I did was pour the bucket full of leeches all over her body. I made sure to cover her from head to toe. Melanie's screams were even louder this time, until weird gurgle noises were coming from her mouth. Well, let's just say her body started to look very bloody, to say the least. The leeches were in a feeding frenzy. Some of them even sucked so much blood that they just popped. And let me say, the smell and noise, Carol interjected. Just please stop. Please, no more. Joe gave a quick pause and looked at Carol. He gave Carol a shit-eating grin and continued on. Well, my dear, I apologize. Anyways, as all this was occurring, I had no idea how long this was going to take. Melanie grew quieter as the time went on. Once I knew that she was indeed no more, I for sure had one hell of a mess to clean up. One thing was very evident. She did indeed lose a lot of blood, considering I used a lot of leeches. The mess was very horrific. Despite the fact that I had a huge mess to clean, I was feeling immensely satisfied afterwards. As I surveyed the entire scene, the leeches that happened to remain just squirmed and wiggled all over. The only real task that remained was getting rid of Melanie's body quickly. Without any regard of her own blood getting on me or my clothes, I untied the rope from her wrist and I hoisted her over my shoulder. I dragged her body over to the huge piranha fish tank that I had mentioned earlier. I already removed the cover prior to this so that this part would be easier for me to do. I placed her body inside the tank head first. The fish moved around so quickly that it was almost just as it was in the movies. Once her head and upper shoulders were being rapidly devoured, I placed the rest of her body into the tank. Yet again, on that same night, another feeding frenzy for my pets. All of her flesh had been stripped clean and nothing but her bones were left. But even the fish hadn't finished the job yet. I knew that I still had to get rid of the remains. I admit that this one was going to be a little trickier. First, I cleaned up the entire mess, leeches, the blood, and the whole works. With any remaining leeches left behind, I too placed them into the piranha tank. The only true way I felt to get rid of all the evidence was to get rid of everything in the aquatic room. So the stereo that I still had turned on, I walked over and grabbed it with both hands and threw it directly into the water of the piranha tank. The electricity and shock killed all the fish at once. I walked over to the wall where the stereo was plugged in and I unplugged it. This made it a little safer for me to approach the tank once more. I grabbed a hammer that I had pinned up to a wall and smashed every single last fish tank I had. This made even more of a mess, I must say, that I would have to clean up later. But I wanted to get all the evidence that had remained in that tank out. This only brought up the one problem that I still had. My servants were still around. Then I had a brilliant idea. I stepped out of the room and closed the door behind me. I did this in order to keep anyone else from seeing the room as well. I blew a whistle, which meant that any servant that was in the nearby area had to stop whatever they were doing and come to me. When one of them showed up, I requested that they run to my work and bring me my shop back. When they finally arrived back with what I asked for, I tipped her like $50. She happily walked away. I cleaned everything up with the shop vac. Fish, leeches, piranhas, and so on and on. Once the shop vac was completely full, I wheeled it out to my yacht and fired up the engines. I headed about 250 miles away from my island. Once I made it to where I felt it was a good distance, I grabbed the shop vac and tied an anchor around it. With great effort, I hoisted both anchor and vacuum into the water. I headed off quickly without even looking back. Now, when I made it back home, I mentioned to all of the servants at once to please not disturb my guest any further for the remainder of her visit. With that all wrapped up, I was guaranteed not to be disturbed by anyone else. Joe was interrupted by Carol, who threw up. The third murder was just too much for her to handle. Her vomit landed all over her and the table she was using to write down notes. Carol was already done with this job and wanted to say, screw all of this. However, she had a few things holding her back, like bills being one of them for sure. Carol was already ready for this part of the story to be over with. Joe's reaction to this, however, was one of happiness and entertainment. He howled with joy. That made Carol feel extremely uncomfortable. Once Joe finally calmed down, he said, "Well, I'm sorry about that. I didn't mean to make you lose your lunch. Say, what did you have for lunch anyway?" He laughed out loud once more. That's when Carol felt a rage inside of her as she snapped, "Look here, this shit is not funny, okay? I have heard all that there is to hear today. I'm ready to leave. I'm done, unless you don't knock it off." "What did you do after?" Carol slowly took a deep breath before Joe continued on. Joe smiled. "Well, once I knew that I had done well for the most part, I got away with 3 successful murders. I celebrated the only way that I knew how, by popping open one of my most expensive bottles of champagne. Oh my, I forgot to mention one important detail about all of this. I managed to get all of the carnage that I had created for myself on a hidden camera in the aquatic room. I would have considered yet another accomplishment." Right after Joe finished that sentence, the clock that was on the wall of Joe's cell came flying right off and hit Joe in the back of his head. This surprised all 3 of them. Max scrambled back and accidentally fell flat on his ass, while Carol stood straight up from her chair saying, "What the fuck?" Joe freaked out and lied on the floor in a fetal position, with one thumb in his mouth, just like a baby. His other free hand was holding the back of his head where the clock had hit him. The very next moment, it was as if everything had happened in slow motion. The clock rose off the floor and levitated in the air. Carol's pen, which was resting on the table, took Carol's piece of paper on her notepad and wrote something down. It was nothing more than a simple sentence. When the pen finished writing, it just fell flat, landing right next to her notebook. Max pulled himself together from the shock, and the same went for Carol as well. She felt like she was about to have a mini panic attack. She somehow managed to shake it off and grabbed the piece of paper and read it. "Dear, your time is running out. We will soon have the last laugh." Chapter 5. When Joe heard this, he panicked even more. He stood up from the floor that he was lying down on. He slowly walked over to one of the cell walls, held his head down, and was silent. Joe pounded the wall with his fist. "No, no, leave me alone! Not again! Please stop bothering me!" Joe appeared broken as he kept repeating what he said over and over and over. Carol just stood there in utter confusion and shock. Max just ended up closing his eyes during all of this because he was just too scared to look. Carol shook herself out of the state that she was in and realized it was now time to leave. She patted Max on the shoulder and told him, "Hurry up and pack the camera and anything else. We're getting the fuck out of here." The noise and commotion was enough to draw the attention of the guards, as one of them said, "Don't worry, ma'am, we will see that you'll be safely escorted out of the building. This will happen to Joe sometimes. He's really starting to act like a damn fool. A couple of drinks later and he'll be out like a light." Carol just nodded her head and said, "Yeah, I bet." Both Carol and Max grabbed all of their items and headed back to the front entrance. They both headed back to Carol's car. Carol and Max were both unsettled and stressed out. Max asked, "Carol, are you okay with what just happened in there?" Carol simply replied with, "I'm good." They got it all filmed on camera, so no way could anyone ever dispute their claim of what they recorded. "We need to head back to the boss and show him what we saw," Max said with a slight grin on his face. Carol nodded her head in agreement, and they both headed off at once. A few minutes later, they were sitting in front of their boss, Randall. He had an oak wood office desk and a standard office chair. His office was also a mess with stacks of unread papers and documents that needed to be edited and on and on. He also had a thing for chomping on cigars. Despite some of his flaws, he was a respectable, fair, and experienced journalist. He had some scruff around his neck and face, and he was in his mid-40s. He wore a wig that was almost impossible not to notice. He was currently chomping on his cigar when Carol and Max arrived. One of Randall's bad habits with the cigars was that he'd never ash them. "Well, I wonder what happens to bring the two of you here, rather than interviewing our main star," he said. Carol replied with, "That's true, we could be doing that still. However, something happened and things got chaotic, so we had to leave. We managed to get something recorded, though." Carol urged Max to break out the camera and show him. Not before long, Randall got a chance to see for himself the events that had occurred and said, "Well, I'll tell you what, that is truly fascinating. You mean to tell me that there is no smoke and mirrors, no camera tricks or special effects?" Carol nodded her head. "Something indeed happened there. I'll tell you one thing, sir. I'm going to get to the bottom of this. I'm going to take all of this seriously. That is, if you happen to sign off on it, of course. For all we know, this can be tied to Joe's murders in some way." Randall managed to finally ash the end of his cigar and give 2 good puffs. He said, "Well, hear me out here. I have a theory. I think maybe, just maybe, it is the spirits of his victims haunting him. Also, be alert. I want the both of you two to try and capture anything else paranormal as well. However, that being said, we still need to maintain our main focus on Joe. So if anything happens along the way while interviewing him, then awesome. Let's do it. So just keep up the good work, the both of yous, and if this turns huge, I'll see to it that you both get a big pay bump at the end of all this. Just hang in there. We only have 5 interviews to go." He stood up from his chair to give himself a stretch. "Well, I wish you two the best of luck." He waved both of them out of his office, but said, "Oh, one more thing. I know I want you both to work very hard. However, please just take tomorrow off so you can recover after those events. I forgot to mention I'm going to buy you guys dinner at the local steakhouse. You can buy whatever you'd like there, as I already called ahead and had the bill taken care of. You can't say I never was a good boss." Carol and Sam were delighted. Once all of their gear was packed up, they both headed out to the steak joint. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been chapters 4 and 5 of Murder Report by James Acosta. Real quick, thank you so much to subscriber EM. EM made that amazing video that we saw at the beginning of the upload tonight. EM, I hope you don't mind that I used an original new song for the channel called "I'm a Slashaholic" to go with your awesome intro video. Really good work. And some more intros that EM created are going to be used going forward on different titles and narrations here on the channel. So I'm looking forward to showing you all those. Great work, EM. Thanks again. We got a really vivid murder story from Sloppy Joe here. I gotta say, the leeches thing, very inventive. I could just like see it playing out. Joe being like, you know, retelling these stories and like almost getting off, you know, at reliving these moments of his life and the lives he took. Very elaborate plan, you know. I'll hand it to Sloppy Joe there. He does get inventive, you know. A simple knife would work, or, you know, a rope or something. But no, he went for leeches and piranhas. But that was a great chapter. Curious to see what the spirit is, like I said before. Now the spirit's hurling clocks at poor little Sloppy Joe. Like the boss Randall. Seems like a newspaper boss, you know, just the way he talked. I kind of envisioned him to kind of be like the Spider-Man editor of the Daily Bugle. But anyways, these were some fun chapters. I'm curious to see what comes next. I actually narrated these chapters days ago and was going to release these chapters this past Saturday or Sunday. But when I went to open up the editing program to put the final touches on checking to make sure all the breaks were taken out where I messed up and stuff, it was corrupt. I lost all my recordings of these chapters and had to redo them. So I apologize. I had wanted to have them out over the weekend a few days ago, but here they are tonight. Hope you enjoyed these chapters. I'll be back with more of these chapters very soon, and also going to be dropping another upload of The Halloween Massacre by Jeremy Terry in the next few days. That's going to be a lot of fun as well. I have to re-record that as well because I had recorded that chapter, same editing thing, corrupt files. But that's okay. Enjoying these books, so if anything, narrating these chapters twice just means I get it done better. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. Let James know what you thought of these chapters in the comments below. And let EM know what you thought of that amazing video intro he made for this upload. And he made the new logo that you see on the screen right now. And until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, be excellent to each other, and remember, the sun never sets on those who ride into it. See you soon.
I'm a slashaholic, addicted to the fright. Narration so hypnotic, Josh keeps me up all night. Eyes and masks and pain, blood runs like the rain. Evil finds its way in the spine-chilling fray. Out of breath but not out of light. Horror digs, don't look behind. Feel the terror crave. Will you dare to slave? I'm a slashaholic, addicted to the fright. Narration so hypnotic, Josh keeps me up all night. I'm a slashaholic, addicted to the fright. Narration so hypnotic, Josh keeps me